Indirect volitives. In this module, we'll look at volitive sequences, or indirect volitives. A sequence is simply where you have one verb that influences the next one. And so the next verb, the following verb, may normally be translated one way, but in a sequence it becomes a volitive indirectly. Now in chapter 18 we saw past time narrative sequences and future time narrative sequences. These are volitive sequences. And we'll see three of them. The first one we've already seen because it's also a future time narrative sequence. The second one is really rather trivial. It's the third one, the purpose or result clause, that's important to know about, and it's a bit more complicated. But I'll walk you through it. So let's look at these. The first one, the imperative followed by perfect plus verb consecutive. This is the one we saw in the future time narrative sequence because it's also a future time narrative sequence. The perfect plus verb consecutive makes it also a future time narrative sequence. The fact that it starts with imperative makes it a volitive sequence, so it's categorized in both groups. And this was the example we saw. Shema Yisrael v'ahavta, Deuteronomy 6. So Shema here is the imperative. Hear, O Israel. Ahavta is the perfect, to love. This ahav here is love, and ta here is the 2ms perfect ending. And we have our little cantillation mark or accent mark here indicating accent shift. So we know we have a vav consecutive here, not a vav conjunctive. So our conditions are met. Imperative, Shema, perfect plus vav consecutive down here. And so what happens is this perfect plus vav consecutive carries forward the imperative sense of the first verb. Hear, O Israel, and love. So we've seen that before. We see it here again as a volitive sequence. This is another example of the same type of sequence. Here we have, this is from Seo chapter 243, and it comes from 1 Samuel 22 verse 5. Lech uvata lecha eretz Yehuda. Lech is an imperative, comes from halach. This is a weak verb, as is the next one, but you'll have to trust me that I'm giving you correct information here. Lech is go in the imperative. Uvata, va or bo, is to enter, or in this case to enter or to come. So go, enter, because this is a perfect here. We've got ta at the end, so a 2ms perfect, just like we had in the previous slide. See, 2ms perfect. So here it is again, with an u in front of it. The vav's changed to u because of the labial. So go, and then we translate this imperatively, because it's in sequence with this. Go and enter. Then often Hebrew will have lecha at the end of imperatives. Go and enter yourself. In other words, it's kind of emphasizes it. Go and enter the land of Judah. So here's another example of the imperative, followed by perfect plus vav consecutive, and the perfect plus vav consecutive then has become an indirect volitive. It's influenced by this volitive. Okay, nothing new there really, other than a new example. The second sequence is simply imperatives followed by imperatives joined with vav conjunctives. And this is just, you would just translate it with a normal and, or perhaps then, to indicate sequence. And the sequence can be chronological or logical, or both. Zachar is to remember, shamar is to keep. Remember and keep. Or perhaps remember and then keep, with a sense of passing of time. Do one first, then do the other. So that's really, this is how you would probably translate it if you just encountered this without knowing anything about volitive sequences. You'd probably translate this one correctly. Remember and keep. So this one's not really that special. It's the third one we want to pay some attention to. Because if you're not aware of this, then you won't get the purpose result meaning out of the sequence. because there's no special words that show up to indicate this. You have to know what the sequence is. Now, the way this sequence works is you start with any volitive, okay, any of the three. We have the imperative, second person, we have the jussive, third person, and the cohortative, first person. So you start with any of those, and then what goes over here? What follows it? Well, not the imperative, at least not with the imperative. Imperative followed by imperative is the sequence we just saw, the one on number 2. This one here. Remember, keep. Remember and keep. Remember, then keep. Okay? So that imperative and imperative is not going to produce a purpose result sequence. Now some of these other ones might. Jussive plus imperative actually does. I'll have an example of that. So you have to be a little careful with these volitive sequences. At this point, I think if you understand this generally and you're aware that they're there, you can go and look at more advanced grammars and get all the details. And also, when you read text, you can pay attention to your volitives and pay attention to your context and see how well these rules hold up. Okay, so not the imperative generally, but it does with the jussive. Imperative, jussive, cohortative, followed by jussive is a purpose clause, or followed by a cohortative, any of those three, any volitive followed by cohortative, or any volitive followed by perfect. Vav plus perfect. Now I don't mean the preterite, the one that has that special vav, that vav. I just mean perfect with this vav. Okay? See if I can get rid of that without destroying everything. Okay? So, any of those combinations, and also, because I'm going to show an example, this combination too. Not this combination, not with the perfect. That was our first sequence. Remember, we had the perfect plus vav consecutive, which looks just like this, and the imperative. Hear, O Israel, and love. The other one was go and enter, the land of Judah or something. So not with this one, that's not a purpose clause, and of course preterite. Preterite holds its own as a simple past tense. So it's this bunch here and this one that will give us our purpose or result sequence of verbs. And generally you will want to translate this with that or so that. Something happens so that something else may happen, or something happens that something else may happen. I've got 3 examples here I want to look at, all from SEO, and they're all from the Bible. The first one is from SEO, page 243, and it's found in Genesis 47, verse 19. And this is where the Egyptians come to Joseph to ask him for seed, for food, because Joseph is in charge of all these granaries, and he's stored up all the food during the time of famine, or for the time of famine. So they come to him and they say, V'ten zera v'necheye v'lo namut. Now, 10 here, this is a weak verb again as well. This comes from natan, it means give or provide. Zera is seed. So give, and to us is implied, give seed to us. V'necheye, chaya is to live, haya is to be. Okay, this is the cha one, so it means to live. And we see n here, so it looks like a imperfect 1 CP form, right? We will give or something. But with this vav and following a imperative, I should write that down here. So imperative, we know this is a cohortative, or it would make sense. Cohortative. So imperative followed by cohortative is the purpose clause, right? Remember we had imperative followed by cohortative. That's one of the permissible combinations to give you a purpose clause. So, give seed, that we may live. Not simply give seed, we will live. Like these things have no relation to each other. You give seed for the purpose that we may live. Give us seed, that we may live. Velo namut. Now, what is this? Mut is to die, comes from mavet, and again, this is a form the verb we'll look at later, but we see the nun there. So again, it looks like an imperfect 1CP form. Now, is it imperfect or is it cohortative? We may think it's cohortative because this one is, but in fact it is imperfect, and we know that. Let me just write this down. Sometimes the imperfect and the cohortative can look the same, but in this case, we know that it is the imperfect because it has lo. Remember, the perfect and the imperfect are negated with lo. The volitives, at least the cohortative and the jussive, are negated with al. Okay? So if we see lo, we know we do not have a cohortative here. We can't, just by definition. But the imperfect, followed by an imperative, is also a purpose clause. Let's go back here. Imperative followed by imperfect. Imperative followed by imperfect, or even cohortative followed by imperfect. Here's a cohortative followed by imperfect. So we've got imperative followed by cohortative followed by another imperfect, right? So on all counts, this is a purpose clause that goes all the way through. Give us seed in order that we may live, in order that we may not die, in order that we will not die, something like that. So, if you didn't know about narrative sequences, or rather volitive sequences, you wouldn't know to give it the good translation it deserves by adding these that's in there, or so that's, to emphasize that this is purpose. You're doing one thing, giving seed, for the purpose of these other two things, living and not dying. Okay, second example. This is, again, from Seo, same page, 243, and it comes from 2 Kings 5, verse 8. And the context here is Naaman has, I was going to say emailed, he has written to the king of Israel to ask him to heal him. And the king of Israel is upset, saying, well, how can I do this? And then Elisha hears about it and sends a message to the king. And this is what he says, or this is part of what he says. Yavo na Eli v'yeda ki eish navi, and then I forgot a word here, b'Yisrael, in Israel. Now, bo again is to come, or to enter, in this case come, and this is the 3ms prefix form, right? So it's imperative, but we'll call it a jussive here. In fact, we know it's a jussive, right? Because we've got na. So let him come. This is Elisha talking to the king about Naaman. Let Naaman come. Let him come. Eli, to me. Remember this here? Pronominal suffixes on irregular forms, it looks like it's plural. El takes pronominal suffixes as if it were a plural form. That's why we have the patak here, rather than the hidik. But anyway, let him come to me. V'yeda. Now this is a jussive. Again, jussive and imperfect are the same form, but given the context here with a jussive, we would say this is a jussive. Let him come to me in order that, purpose clause, in order, or purpose sequence, in order that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. I forgot in Israel here. So we have jussive followed by jussive. It's not let him come to me, he will know there is a prophet in Israel, as if the one had no relation to the other. Let him come to me so I can demonstrate that there is a prophet in Israel. In other words, by healing him, which the king couldn't do. And ironically, which the king didn't even seem to realize that there was a prophet in Israel. But that's an issue from the larger context. Okay, so jussive followed by jussive is also a purpose clause. I guess we can go right back here and see this. Jussive followed by jussive. Now, the one I want to show you next is this one here. And Ross doesn't make this explicit, but Jussive followed by imperative can also be a purpose clause. And this is the example, and this is from Sale, page 244, and it comes from Ruth, chapter 1, verse 9. And this is where Naomi is speaking to her two daughters-in-law, and this is part of what she says just before she heads back to Jerusalem, or to Bethlehem from Moab. Yitain Adonai lachem umetzena menucha. Okay, Natan, we've already seen Natan a couple times. Our nun, by the way, is that little dot there, Dagish, but we'll come to that later. So we have Natan with the Yud, so we have 3 MS. Again, we're dealing with a Jussive here. And here, Natan means to give. Maybe grant is a better way to translate this one. May the Lord grant to you. May the Lord grant to you. Now here, matzah is to find. And this here is mitzena. This is a feminine, plural, imperative. Imperative. Well, you know what I'm saying. It's supposed to be an R. Now, if you didn't know about Voltive sequences, the translation here would be a bit awkward. May the Lord grant to you, and then she says, find rest. Menucha is rest. Why is she then commanding them to find rest? Because this is a imperative here. May the Lord grant to you what? And then find rest. Well, as a purpose clause, you could translate this, may the Lord grant that you find rest. And then she goes on to say, each of you in the house of her husband. In other words, their husbands had died, and she's wishing that they will get remarried and have a home. So this is very much a purpose clause. May the Lord grant to you that, translate this, introduction to this as that you may find rest. If you weren't aware of this, it would really make for an awkward translation. So now, what do you do with this chart, eh? So many little bits and pieces to it. If this structure here is helpful to you, it is to me, because I can see things laid out spatially, then write that down so that you can remember it. You may forget some of the details. I don't think that's too important. As long as you remember that there is such a thing as Voltive sequences that produce purpose or result clauses, and you translate them with that or so that. And then when you encounter them, you can come back and take a look at this or look at some other grammar book and refresh yourself with what the details are. But be aware that purpose clauses and result clauses exist with volitives, and so sometimes you have to translate the volitive a little differently than you would normally. And of course the other two, if I can skip back here. This one is simple, imperative followed by imperative, just put and between them. And this one we've already seen. Well, let's go back to the one this one we're more familiar with. The perfect plus vav consecutive will take the meaning of the previous imperative, just like it takes the meaning of a previous imperfect, a future, or whatever.